There is a question that almost no one has the courage to ask, because the answer can destroy an identity built over a lifetime. What if what you've always called empathy has never really been empathy? What if this constant weight of feeling everyone's pain, this almost irresistible need to alleviate the suffering of others, this inability to remain indifferent to other people's emotions, is not a spiritual gift, but the invisible scar of an ancient battle fought within your own soul? Carl Jung used to remember that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It just keeps directing our life as long as we believe we are making free choices. Perhaps this is exactly what is happening to thousands of people who today recognize themselves as empaths. They believe they have a rare sensitivity, a kind of call to welcome the suffering of the world. However, in the light of analytical psychology, this story reveals much deeper symbols than meets the eye. What seems like virtue can hide survival. What looks like a mission can hide an old prison. We live in a time that has turned the empath into an almost mystical figure, the one who feels everything, who perceives invisible energies, who enters an environment and immediately absorbs the emotional mood of the people present. Many describe this experience as if they were emotional sponges, unable to prevent the sadness, anxiety, or fear of others from crossing their own boundaries. The greater the suffering around them, the greater seems to be their responsibility to welcome, understand, and alleviate this pain. But Jung invites us to look at this phenomenon with different eyes, not to deny human sensibility, but to ask where it really comes from. After all, every psychic force has an origin. No behavior appears without roots. No emotional pattern remains for decades without feeding on something much older than consciousness can see. There is a profound difference between feeling someone's pain and making that pain part of one's own identity. True empathy brings you closer without imprisoning. It allows us to understand the suffering of others without abandoning one's own center. Emotional fusion does just the opposite. It dissolves the boundaries of consciousness until it is no longer possible to distinguish where the other's pain ends and where its own begins. This distinction, apparently simple, was one of the great concerns of Carl Jung's work. For him, the human soul naturally seeks integration, but when the ego loses its contours, there is no longer a true encounter. The individual no longer welcomes the other. It disappears into it. And this disappearance is often mistaken for love, kindness, or compassion. It is precisely here that the shadow begins to reveal its first signs. In Jung's symbolic language, the shadow does not only represent our repressed impulses, it also houses everything that we refuse to see about ourselves, because it threatens the image we have built of our own personality. The empath often cultivates a persona based on the idea of being indispensable, understanding, available, and morally elevated. This mask receives praise, recognition, and social validation. She looks beautiful. It looks luminous. But every intense light casts an equally deep shadow. What if behind the need to save everyone there is a silent fear of abandoning oneself? What if this compulsion to relieve the suffering of others hides a much greater difficulty, to remain in the face of one's own pain? These questions often cause discomfort because they directly affect what Jung called unconscious identification. While we believe that we are only what we show the world, we remain distant from the self, the deepest center of the personality. Individuation, the central concept of all his work, begins precisely when this identification begins to crumble. Perhaps this is why so many people feel constantly exhausted. They do not only carry external problems, they carry old psychological roles. They become advisors to all, conflict mediators, permanent emotional refugees. They listen for hours. They absorb anguish. They try to prevent ruptures. They assume responsibilities that never belong to them. And when they are finally alone, they experience an emptiness that is difficult to explain. It's not because they felt too much. It is because they have forgotten to remain present within themselves. In the symbolic tradition studied by Jung and deeply influenced by the esoteric currents that investigated the evolution of consciousness, no soul grows, carrying that which belongs to the destiny of another. The true spiritual path has never been to absorb collective suffering, but to illuminate one's own unconscious. Only those who pierce their own darkness can offer true presence without turning help into a permanent sacrifice. It is exactly at this point that the modern myth of the empath begins to unravel, not because sensitivity is an illusion, but because perhaps it is being interpreted through a mistaken lens. What seems like an extraordinary capacity for love can hide an extremely old, sophisticated, and unconscious psychic mechanism, repeated so many times that it has come to seem part of nature itself. And Jung leaves us with a question that is impossible to ignore. If this almost compulsive need to carry the pain of the world was not born as a gift, where did it really begin? The answer is not in the experiences of adulthood, nor in some invisible energy. It rests long before that, in the quiet territory where personality began to be shaped, when a child discovered that his own survival might depend on feeling, anticipating, and controlling the emotions of those who were supposed to protect him. Here is the continuation of the narrative, maintaining the progression of the original script, with Carl Jung as a guiding presence, symbolic, contemplative language, and coherent with Part 1. Carl Jung said that what most governs an adult life was rarely born in adulthood. Forces that seem spontaneous tend to have much deeper roots, hidden in early childhood experiences when consciousness was still being shaped and the soul was silently learning what strategies it needed to develop in order to survive. It is precisely there, long before anyone identifies as an empath, that the real story begins. Imagine a child entering the house after school. Before she even takes off her shoes, she discreetly observes her father's face. The silence feels different that day. The steps are heavier. The expression is closed. No words were spoken, but his entire body goes into a state of alert. She learns that a simple detail can announce an outburst of anger, an argument, or hours of tension inside the house. Without realizing it, he begins to develop an extraordinary ability, reading emotions even before they are expressed. Now, imagine another scene. A girl finds her mother crying in the kitchen. Instead of running to play, he slowly approaches, hugs his mother, and tries to make her smile. She's still too young to understand the problems of adults, but she feels with all her intensity that she needs to do something. Gradually, she stops living as a child to take the place of caregiver, not because anyone asked for it directly, but because their unconscious concluded that the safety of that family depended on their ability to relieve the pain of others. These stories seem different, but they have the same invisible root. In both, the child learns that his own well-being is conditioned by the emotional state of those who should protect him. He comes to believe that anticipating feelings, avoiding conflicts, and regulating other people's emotions is a matter of survival. This learning is so profound that it ceases to be a conscious behavior and becomes a permanent structure of the personality. Jung observed that when a pattern of this nature sets in too early, it ceases to seem like a choice. It becomes second nature. The person grows up believing that they were simply born that way when in fact they are repeating an old adaptation created in a moment of extreme vulnerability. What was once protection becomes years later a prison. Maybe you know someone like that, or maybe you're acknowledging your own history. That person who immediately notices when someone is sad, even if no one says a word, who enters an environment and feels the need to restore harmony. Who blames himself when he notices a distant friend, an angry partner, or a family member in suffering. She believes she needs to solve something. Even when no one has asked for help, they are already looking for a solution. The most curious thing is that this behavior is usually admired. Everyone praises his sensitivity. They say she has a huge heart. That always thinks of others before thinking of herself. Gradually, this image becomes his persona, the social mask described by Jung. The more recognition you receive for being indispensable, the more difficult it becomes to abandon that role. After all, who would she be if she stopped carrying the world on her back? But there is a detail that is almost never noticed. While this person dedicates all his energy to understanding the pain of others, he loses contact with his own emotions. She knows how to perfectly explain the suffering of her partner, friends, children, or co-workers. But when someone asks how she really is, an unexpected silence arises. She automatically responds that she is fine, even though she feels a tiredness that seems to have no end. It is like a mirror that has spent so many years reflecting the faces of others that it has forgotten its own image. In Jung's language, this is one of the clearest signs of the loss of differentiation. The ego becomes excessively porous. The boundaries between the internal and external worlds slowly disappear. The joys of others determine your peace. The anxieties of others become your anxieties. The responsibilities of others start to occupy his thoughts for days. and what began as an adaptation mechanism becomes a permanent way of existing. There is yet another, much deeper phenomenon. Jung noted that a child does not only absorb the emotional climate of the family, she also interjects content that belongs to the shadow of adults. Unresolved fears, silent guilt, pent-up frustrations, and constant anxieties can settle in the child's psyche as if they were their own experiences. Decades later, the adult feels a weight that is difficult to explain. He experiences guilt for no apparent reason, fears that seem to have no origin, an exaggerated responsibility in the face of the happiness of everyone around him. He believes that this burden was born with him, when, in fact, part of it never belonged to him. Perhaps this is why so many empaths feel an ancient sadness, almost impossible to name. It is not just the suffering of the people they encounter today. It is the echo of very old emotions that continue to live within them, silently repeating a story that began when they did not yet have the resources to understand it. And here comes a revelation that completely changes the perspective of this journey. Oversensitivity may never have been the real problem. The problem may lie in the reason why it was built. Because when a child learns that loving means taking on emotional responsibilities that are not his own, he grows up believing that he only deserves to exist as long as he is saving someone. This belief remains hidden for many years. It only changes scenery. Parents are replaced by partners, friends, co-workers, and even strangers. Faces change, situations change, but the old covenant remains exactly the same. And it is precisely this silent repetition that Carl Jung identified as one of the greatest obstacles to individuation. Because while the adult continues to try to repair the emotional wounds of everyone around him, there is a forgotten child inside him, waiting for the first time, for someone to finally look at his own pain. And it is at this moment that the most dangerous cycle of all begins to be born. That of the wounded healer, the one who dedicates his entire life trying to save others without realizing that, deep down, he has always been trying to save himself. Here is the sequel. Maintaining the progression of the original script, deepening the Jungian perspective, and preserving Carl Jung as the intellectual presence that drives the entire narrative. The development follows the base content of the submitted script, expanding it in an authorial way. When that child grows up, the old survival mechanism doesn't disappear. He just changes his clothes. Carl Jung said that what is not made conscious returns as destiny. The adult believes he is making free choices, but he is often just obeying a script written decades earlier, when he still confused love with responsibility and security with constant vigilance. This is how the wounded healer is born, not as someone who chose to save the world, but as someone who never learned that he didn't have to. This compulsion rarely manifests itself dramatically. It appears in the small decisions of everyday life. The person responds immediately to messages from those in crisis, even when they are emotionally drained, cancels important appointments to solve problems that are not yours. He sleeps thinking about the difficulties of others and wakes up looking for new ways to help them. When she finally finds a few minutes of silence, she feels guilt instead of rest, as if taking care of herself were a form of abandonment. The most intriguing thing is that this behavior is often confused with emotional maturity. Society praises those who endure everything, who never complain, who are always available. Few realize that there is a huge difference between serving out of awareness and serving out of compulsion. The first strengthens the soul. The second empties it slowly. But there is a question that almost no one asks. If helping really produces peace, why do so many people who are deeply devoted to others live exhausted, anxious, and emotionally empty? Perhaps because the unconscious goal was never to help. Perhaps it was to prevent an old sense of abandonment from reappearing. Jung observed that complexes have a curious characteristic. They don't just influence our decisions, they also choose the people who come into our lives. This explains why some individuals seem to repeat the same type of relationship over and over again. The names change, the cities change, the circumstances change, but the script remains eerily similar. There is always someone to be saved, someone emotionally unavailable, someone who demands more energy than they give, someone whose pain seems to immediately awaken the need to protect you. At first glance, this seems like bad luck. However, analytical psychology proposes a much deeper interpretation. We are not attracted only by what we consciously desire. We are also attracted to that which dialogues with our unconscious contents. The wounded healer encounters injured people because their identity was built around the need to heal. Without realizing it, he feels familiarity where he should perceive danger. It confuses intensity with connection. It confuses need with love. It confuses shared suffering with destiny. It is precisely here that the shadow acts more silently. While consciousness says, "I just want to help," another part of the psyche seeks something completely different. It seeks to confirm an old belief that your worth depends on your ability to solve someone's pain. This belief is so deep that, when he finds a healthy relationship, he often feels estranged. Where there is no one to save, a void arises that is difficult to explain. Tranquility seems to lack passion. Balance feels like distance. Peace seems purposeless. What if the true addiction has never been the suffering of the other, but the feeling of being indispensable? This hypothesis is uncomfortable because it directly touches the persona built over years. However, Jung reminded us that all transformation begins when we have the courage to remove the masks that we have mistaken for our identity. There's another aspect that is little discussed. Psychic energy is limited. Every time it is continuously invested in trying to regulate the emotions of others, it fails to feed the process of individuation itself. Gradually, the person loses touch with their authentic desires. You no longer know what you like, what dreams you really have, or what choices you would make if you weren't constantly busy taking care of other people's lives. His existence begins to revolve around external needs, while his inner world remains forgotten, like an abandoned house whose windows remain closed for many years. Perhaps this is why so many people describe a strange feeling of emptiness after solving someone else's big problem. For a while they experience satisfaction, but soon after another crisis arises, another person in need, another emotional fire to put out. The cycle never ends. Not because the world produces infinite suffering, but because the psychic structure still believes that there is value only when there is someone who needs to be saved. Jung saw in this movement a sophisticated form of projection. By continually attempting to repair the wounds of others, the individual avoids coming into contact with his or her own wounded child. It is much less painful to organize external chaos than to cross one's own unconscious. As long as there is someone to advise, listen to, or protect, it becomes possible to postpone the most difficult encounter of all, the one with one's own wounds, fears, and needs. This is precisely why many wounded healers experience overwhelming guilt when they finally say no. It's not just about the fear of disappointing someone. It is as if his entire identity is threatened. If I am not the one who saves, who am I? If I let the other face their own responsibilities, will I still be loved? Will I still have value? These questions remain hidden for years, quietly governing decisions that seem rational but are actually driven by old unconscious complexes. And here comes one of the most important revelations of the entire journey proposed by Carl Jung. True compassion never requires self-destruction. It does not ask someone to abandon their own soul to sustain someone else's soul. On the contrary, the more integrated one is with one's own self, the greater one's ability to offer presence without losing oneself. The wounded healer believes that he needs to carry the suffering of others in order to love. The individual, in the process of individuation, discovers that to love is to remain present without taking for oneself what belongs to the destiny of the other. But this leads us to an even deeper question. If this compulsion to save is not true empathy, then what did Carl Jung understand as authentic empathy? How can one deeply welcome another human being without disappearing within their pain? The answer definitively breaks the myth of the empath and reveals a much more difficult but infinitely more liberating path. Here is the continuation of the narrative, maintaining the structure of the base script, deepening Carl Jung's vision, and preserving the dramatic progression. The content develops Part 4, from the concepts present in the submitted material, without changing its essence. Carl Jung believed that there is a huge difference between feeling someone's pain and abandoning one's own soul to accompany it. This distinction seems simple when it is just an idea, but it completely transforms life when it is finally understood. Because the real challenge has never been learning to love others. The real challenge has always been to remain whole while loving yourself. Perhaps you have already witnessed a seemingly ordinary scene. A person enters a room visibly haggard. Before any words are uttered, one immediately feels an inexplicable weight on one's chest.
The environment seems to change temperature. The silence becomes uncomfortable.
Minutes later, this person is already trying to cheer up those who suffer, offering advice, looking for solutions, or taking on responsibilities that no one asked for. Most interpret this as proof of great empathy. Jung would see something much more complex happening at that moment. He said that human consciousness has an extraordinary capacity to perceive emotional states, but he also warned of a little understood danger. Perceiving does not mean absorbing. True perception broadens consciousness. Absorption dissolves identity. When these two experiences are confused, what many call extreme sensitivity is born, but which often represents only a difficulty in maintaining healthy psychic boundaries. Interestingly, several experienced therapists report a similar phenomenon throughout their careers. Professionals who spend decades listening to deeply painful stories are unable to continue their work because they have learned to carry each suffering with them. They remain because they have developed the ability to be fully present without turning the pain of the other into personal heritage. This difference explains why some end each service emotionally destroyed, while others preserve serenity even in the face of the most difficult stories. Presence heals much more than fusion. But then, an inevitable question arises. If absorbing suffering doesn't make anyone more compassionate, why do so many people believe that this weight is proof of true love? Jung would respond by saying that the ego tends to confuse intensity with depth. The more intense an emotion seems, the truer it seems. However, the unconscious does not work in this way. Many intense emotions are just old complexes, awakening in the face of familiar situations. It's like an old scar that hurts whenever the weather changes. Pain seems current, but its origin belongs to the past. There's a curious account found in different spiritual traditions that dialogues deeply with this idea. Contemplative masters used to claim that one candle can illuminate hundreds of others without losing its own flame. If, to illuminate someone, it was necessary to turn off one's own light, there would be no illumination, only shared darkness.
Jung never used this metaphor exactly, but his understanding of the self leads in the same direction. The more integrated a personality is, the more it radiates stability to those around it, without having to sacrifice its own vital energy. The wounded healer, however, lives the exact opposite. He believes that to love means to slowly consume one's own strength. The more tired you feel, the more you believe you are fulfilling your mission.
The more he renounces his own needs, the more he convinces himself that he is evolving spiritually. However, the psyche exacts a silent price for this imbalance. That price doesn't always pop up first in the mind. It often arises in the body. Persistent insomnia, constant feeling of fatigue, anxiety with no apparent cause, recurrent muscle pain, difficulty relaxing even during moments of rest. Jung observed that the psyche has numerous ways of communicating what consciousness insists on ignoring. When the soul spends too long sacrificing its own truth, the body often begins to speak for it. Perhaps this is exactly why so many people describe the feeling of living permanently connected. They enter a restaurant and discreetly observe all the tables. They notice who looks sad, who argued before arriving, who's trying to hide tears. They do this automatically. Not because they want to, because his nervous system learned very early on that observing everything was the best way to stay safe. The radar continues to work decades later, even when there is no real danger. But here, one of the greatest illusions of consciousness takes place. This hypervigilance is often referred to as spiritual intuition. In many cases, it actually identifies emotional changes with astonishing accuracy. The mistake is not in perception. The mistake is in the interpretation. The organism continues to react as if it was still trapped in the unpredictable environment of childhood. The past continues to use the senses of the present to confirm a threat that has already ended. Jung insisted that individuation begins exactly when we can stop this automatic repetition. It doesn't mean failing to understand people's emotions. It means ceasing to believe that every perceived emotion requires an intervention. This is perhaps one of the most difficult forms of psychological maturity. To remain in the face of pain without assuming ownership, listen deeply without turning listening into mission, reaching out without carrying someone on your shoulders. There's a fascinating detail noted by many Jungian analysts over the decades. When an individual begins a true process of inner integration, their relationships begin to change spontaneously. Not because he decides to abandon people, but because he stops feeding dynamics built on emotional dependence. Some relationships naturally become healthier, others simply disappear. There is no conflict. There is only a silent reorganization of life around someone who has finally ceased to occupy the place of emotional regulator of the world. This phenomenon seems almost mysterious to those who live it. People who once required constant attention begin to look for other sources of validation. Old conflicts lose intensity. Conversations become lighter. The individual realizes that he has never been responsible for anyone's transformation. He just believed he was. And when this belief disappears, an immense amount of psychic energy returns inside, like a river that finally finds its own bed. It is at this moment that Carl Jung leads us to the most liberating understanding of this whole journey. True empathy is not born of the need to save. It is born from the awareness that two souls can walk side by side without one having to live the destiny of the other. To love is not to carry. Compassion is not emotional fusion. Presence is not sacrifice. And only when this truth ceases to be a concept and becomes an inner experience does the wounded healer finally begin to find his way back to himself. But there is still a decisive step. Intellectually understanding this difference is not enough. It is necessary to rebuild the entire structure of the personality on a new foundation. Jung gave a name to this inner rebirth. He called it individuation. And it is precisely on this path that the former empath stops living as a prisoner of collective pain, to discover, perhaps for the first time, who he really is when he no longer needs to save anyone to deserve to exist. It follows the sequel, preserving the structure of the original script, deepening the concept of individuation as presented in the base material, and keeping Carl Jung as the common thread of the entire narrative. The text remains faithful to the thematic progression of the submitted script, expanding its ideas in an authorial way. Carl Jung said that no true transformation happens while we continue to try to change only the world around us. The great revolution always begins when consciousness accepts to turn inward. It is at this moment that the path of individuation ceases to be a theory and becomes a living experience. For many, this is the most difficult stage of the entire journey because it requires abandoning the identity that for years seemed to give meaning to one's existence. Imagine someone who has spent decades believing that they were born to take care of everyone. This person built friendships, relationships, professional choices, and even their image before the family around this role. She has always been remembered as the one who listens, advises, resolves conflicts, and remains strong when everyone falls apart. Now imagine the impact of discovering that this mission may never have been a call of the soul, but just a strategy created by a child who needed to survive emotionally. Few revelations are as uncomfortable as this one. Jung claimed that the ego resists intensely whenever an old identity begins to crumble. Not because this identity is true, but because it offers a sense of security. Even a prison can feel comfortable when we spend enough time living inside it. That is why many people, when starting a deep process of self-knowledge, experience an unexpected paradox. They want to change, but at the same time they are afraid of their own freedom. This fear usually appears in very discreet ways. For the first time, the person decides not to immediately respond to a drama-laden message, resolve not to take on a problem that belongs to someone else. He says no without giving long justifications, and almost immediately, intense guilt arises, as if he had committed a grave injustice. In fact, it is not guilt. It's the old script trying to regain control. For years, the unconscious associated love with renunciation. Now, every time a healthy boundary arises, this old programming reacts as if survival is threatened. But there is a decisive question. If setting limits causes so much discomfort, has the suffering always been caused by the people around you? Or could it be that the greatest prison has always been within the psychological structure built throughout childhood? Carl Jung would answer that no one attains the self as long as he continues to live exclusively through the persona. The empath persona seems admirable. She's kind, helpful, welcoming, and seemingly selfless. However, when this mask becomes the only possible way to exist, it ceases to serve consciousness and begins to govern it. The individual no longer helps because he chooses to help. It helps because it believes that without it, it will lose its value, its place, and even the right to be loved. It is precisely at this point that individuation requires an inevitable encounter with the shadow. Many imagine that the shadow is formed only by negative impulses, but Jung saw something much deeper. It also holds all the parts of the personality that were sacrificed to maintain a certain image in the world. In the case of the wounded healer, the shadow often harbors the right to rest, to feel angry, to refuse requests, to recognize limits, and even to admit one's own tiredness. Everything that has been repressed to sustain the image of someone eternally available remains alive, waiting to be recognized. There is a fascinating aspect noted by several Jungian analysts. When a person begins to truly integrate these forgotten contents, their energy changes direction. Before, almost all of his vitality was consumed trying to reorganize the lives of others. Now that same energy starts to fuel creativity, purpose, inner silence, and personal growth. It's not that she becomes less loving. On the contrary, for the first time, your compassion ceases to be born of necessity and begins to arise from freedom. This change produces surprising effects. People who previously depended on her constantly begin to find her new posture strange. Some try to reawaken the old guilt. Others say that she has changed, that she has become cold, distant, or selfish. This is usually one of the most delicate moments of individuation, because the old system of relationships begins to lose its balance. Those who were used to receiving unlimited energy miss that dynamic. The wounded healer realizes then that many connections were sustained not by love, but by the silent dependence created over years. This is exactly where one of the biggest twists and turns of this journey happens. For a long time, Empaths believed that his greatest quality was to carry the pains of the world. Now he begins to realize that his true strength was never in it. His true strength has always been his ability to remain conscious. The more he recovers contact with the self, the less need he feels to control the destiny of others. You discover that being present is much more powerful than trying to solve everything. Jung used to say that the psyche naturally seeks balance. When we stop wasting energy, sustaining conflicts that do not belong to us, this energy returns to its origin. It is as if a river, diverted for years to irrigate foreign lands, finally returned to its own bed. Gradually, the anxiety decreases. Silence ceases to frighten. Loneliness turns into company. The constant need for approval loses strength, and what once seemed empty turns out to be a fertile space where a new identity begins to be born. However, there is one last obstacle that few can cross without resistance. It is not enough to intellectually understand that we are not responsible for anyone's happiness. It is also necessary to accept an even deeper truth. We may never have tried to save only the people around us. Perhaps every gesture of rescue, every excess of care, every silent sacrifice was an unconscious attempt to go back to the past and finally offer protection to the child who once believed he was alone in the face of chaos. This perception changes absolutely everything, because at that moment the focus is no longer on external relations and returns definitively inwards. The wounded healer understands that he has spent years searching in each person he has met for an opportunity to repair an old pain that could never be resolved in this way. And when that illusion finally shatters, there's only one last step left, the bravest of all: to look directly at one's own wounded child, to abandon the need to save the world, and to discover that true liberation was never in carrying other souls, but in reconciling with one's own. It is exactly this final encounter that Carl Jung invites us to carry out, and in it lies the most transformative conclusion of this entire journey. Here is the closure of the narrative, maintaining the progression of the base script, concluding the journey started in Part 1, and preserving Carl Jung as the central presence that inspires each reflection. The text develops the conclusion from the content of the submitted script, expanding its ideas in an authorial and coherent way. Throughout this journey, perhaps the most difficult discovery was not understanding Carl Jung. Maybe it was understanding yourself. Because there is a huge difference between acquiring knowledge and allowing that knowledge to transform the way we see our own lives. For a long time, you may have believed that you were born to carry people's suffering. He may have been proud of the ability to perceive invisible emotions, to always be available, to offer shelter when everyone around him seemed lost. But now a question remains before you with a force that is impossible to ignore. Who would you be if you stopped living only to support the emotional weight of others? Jung said that
Consciousness grows whenever we have the courage to abandon a comfortable illusion to embrace a liberating truth. No individuation happens without renunciation. No awakening happens without the collapse of an old identity. Perhaps this is exactly what is happening right now, not because you're losing who you are, but because you're discovering that you were never just the persona built to survive. The wounded child believed that she needed to anticipate conflict in order to remain safe. He needed to calm those who screamed, console those who cried, hide his own needs to preserve the balance of the family. That strategy was smart. Perhaps it was the only possible one at that moment in life. It allowed me to get through situations that seemed bigger than a child could bear. However, what protects a child cannot always accompany an adult. The mechanism that once saved his emotional survival may become, decades later, the very prison that prevents his freedom. This is one of Carl Jung's most profound teachings. The unconscious does not want to punish us. He wants to be recognized. Every repetition, every exhausting relationship, every sense of guilt when saying no, every desperate attempt to save someone represents a silent invitation to look in the direction of what remains hidden. Suffering ceases to be just a burden when we understand that it can also be a language of the soul. Perhaps you are realizing for the first time that you have never been responsible for the happiness of all the people who have passed through your life. This does not mean abandoning compassion. It means freeing him from guilt. True compassion is not born of the need to control destinies that do not belong to us. It is born of conscious presence. It is born from the courage to stay by someone's side without taking away from that person the responsibility for their own path. There is a symbolic image very present in Jung's work. He compared the process of inner transformation to the work of the alchemist. The alchemist did not create gold by adding something new to the raw metal. He believed that gold already existed in a hidden state and needed only to be revealed through a long process of purification. Individuation follows exactly this logic. You don't have to become someone else. You just need to remove the layers of fear, guilt, conditioning, and old adaptations that have hidden what has always existed in your essence. Therefore, the first practical step begins in a simple but profoundly transformative way. Observe your impulses before acting. Whenever that urgent need to sort out someone's life arises, take a break. Breathe. Ask yourself, is this responsibility really mine, or does it belong to this person's path? This question alone interrupts an automatic pattern built up over years. Then start practicing boundaries without turning them into walls. A healthy limit does not keep away those you love. He protects that which makes love possible. Saying no, when necessary, does not diminish your kindness. Preserving your energy doesn't make you selfish. On the contrary, only those who remain whole can offer true presence without feeding emotional dependencies. Also, take quiet time to find yourself. Jung believed that dialogue with the unconscious requires listening. Write about your emotions, observe your dreams, reflect on situations that arouse disproportionate guilt or excessive need for approval. Many answers will not come immediately, but with each small gesture of awareness, you strengthen your relationship with the self, that silent center of the personality that never ceased to exist, even when the persona occupied all the space. Maybe some people are surprised by his change. Perhaps they interpret their new limits as coldness. They may try to make him believe that taking care of himself is abandoning others. Remember that not all resistance means you're on the wrong path. Often, it only reveals that old patterns have ceased to find space to continue existing. Remaining faithful to one's own process of individuation requires courage, but it is precisely this courage that transforms an entire life. And when you finally understand that you no longer need to carry the suffering of the world to deserve love, you will discover something extraordinary. Your sensibility will continue to exist, but it will no longer be a current. It will be a source of lucidity. You will continue to perceive people's pain, but you will not allow it to destroy your peace. He will continue to offer help, but without abandoning his own soul. Compassion will cease to be a burden and will become a conscious choice. At that moment, the wounded healer begins to disappear, giving way to a whole human being, capable of loving without losing himself, of welcoming without dissolving, and of walking alongside others without forgetting his own path. Maybe this was just a conversation between you and Carl Jung.
Or Maybe it was a meeting between you and parts of yourself that had remained silent for many years. If any of these reflections touched your story, don't allow it to end here. Write in the comments, what was the moment that most awakened your conscience? If you prefer to preserve your identity, you can comment anonymously or share only what you feel comfortable with. Your experience can help others who are also starting this path of transformation. If this content has brought a new perspective to your life, leave your likes and subscribe to the channel. With each new video, we will continue to explore, together, the paths of Carl Jung's depth psychology, shadow, individuation, and the extraordinary journey of discovery of the true self.